In 1966, Everett Delano was shot and killed during a robbery in an auto repair shop in central New Hampshire. Decades later, evidence left behind at the scene revealed new clues. Now, investigators say this man, Thomas Cass, was the man who pulled the trigger.
There are some instances in life where you might have felt that you were in the wrong place at a very wrong time. But what would happen if these situations turn out to be life-threatening and deadly? Today, in this video, we are going to look at mysteries in which the victims found themselves in absurd and unlikely scenarios, which turned out to be the cause of their death. Sadly, for the families and friends left desperately longing for answers and closure, the cases would slowly go cold. They would remain that way until advancements in forensic technology would finally bring them resolution. If intrigued, stay tuned as Mysterious 7 explores the thawing of these two cold cases. Number 1. Everett Delano stayed busy. Between working as security as an overnight watchman and his part-time shifts at a combo gas station, he was putting in 60 hours a week. He had 3 kids, Daryl, Darlene, and Denise, and he worked hard to provide for them. The family had lived all over the place, with his work in the U.S. Navy in radar and radio operations. From Rhode Island to Florida, from California to South Carolina, Everett had a successful career achieving the rank of Chief Petty Officer. He had entered the service in 1941 at the outset of World War II and served throughout the war, primarily on ships in the Pacific. The family mostly lived in base housing as they moved around, but although their scenery and friendships changed from year to year, they were anchored by visits to and from Everett's extended family in Orange, Massachusetts, and his wife's family near New London, New Hampshire. Everett would at times be gone for months at a time while serving at sea on ships in the Mediterranean. But when he was in town working on the base, he had regular hours and would spend a lot of time with his family. As the kids grew older, the family would begin to have a strong desire for stability in their lives, and they decided to settle down near her family in Wilmot, New Hampshire, a small town nestled in the valleys of the mountains that lay between Concord and Lebanon in New Hampshire. As in 1964, Everett would finally retire from the Navy. Everett was a high-ranking enlisted man in the Navy with authority and a lot of responsibility, and Daryl suspected that he may have struggled to adapt to his new life as a civilian. He looked for work in radio or television repair, but he couldn't find anything close enough to Wilmot, and after an entire career of short commutes while living on base, he wasn't too keen on an hour-plus commute to nearby larger towns. Although he was still looking around for other options, in the meantime, he worked as a security officer on the night shift at Colby Sawyer College in New London, and he picked up shifts at a gas station in Andover. The day of the murder, September 1st, 1966, would start out as just another day for Everett. He drove by the familiar colonial-style buildings with their signature green shutters and dormer windows that he would see daily as he cruised down Main Street in Andover, another small town that, even in 2021, still didn't have a stoplight. He pulled into Sanborn Auto Body where he worked. Kenneth Sanborn, the owner, was partnered with Gulf Oil and had the prototypical Gulf service station, a 2-bay garage attached to a small office area with a walk-up window, where most of the gas transactions were handled. The front of the building was flat as a pancake, and the notched top provided a little architectural character, finished off with a white sliding background. The town's post office was also contained within the small building, and together it was a hub of activity for the little town. Get your car fixed, get your mail, and get some gas. At 8:50 a.m. that morning, Kenneth asked Everett to hold down the fort because he was heading out to run some errands. Everett primarily helped in the office ringing up transactions and at the pump refilling customers' cars with fuel. This was the era of full-service gas stations and gas station attendants. Between 8:50 a.m. and 9:25 a.m., there was activity every 10 minutes or so. The cash register tape indicated that 3 sales had occurred. At 9:25 a.m., a local familiar with Everett drove by the station and waved to him. He was backing up a vehicle at that moment. He smiled and waved back. An armed robbery would occur at the Sanborn auto body shop between 9:25 a.m. and 9:35 a.m. that morning, and Everett was the only employee there at the time. The thief confronted Everett and confiscated all the money that was in the register's cash drawer, which was estimated to be about $75 to $100. The assailant, however, failed to locate the hidden cash box, which contained an additional $500. A few minutes after they departed, a white vehicle pulled up and waited for a bit, hoping that an attendant would help them get their tank filled. When no one appeared, they grew impatient. Around 9:45 a.m., a couple of guys showed up. They saw a white car leaving, and the woman driving it shrugged her shoulders as if to say, "I don't know where the attendant is, so I'm taking off." The guys popped their heads into the office and heard some noise that sounded almost like a snoring. They saw a man lying face down on the office floor and thought that maybe he was passed out drunk. Closer to 10 a.m., 3 more men arrived. The 2 men were still there, and they told the new group that someone was asleep inside on the floor. One of the guys took a look in the office and discovered a pool of blood forming under the man's head, and he immediately called the New Hampshire State Police, as well as the nearest hospital in New London. Meanwhile, a guy from the first group of 2 men drove to a nearby Sanborn residence and fetched Kenneth's wife. They noticed that the cash register drawer was left open and empty, and they started to put 2 and 2 together. This was a crime scene and a horrific tragedy. Both the police and the paramedics arrived promptly, and Everett was transported to New London Hospital, where he was stabilized. Police initially believed that he was the victim of a vicious beating, and it wasn't until he was inspected by medical professionals that it was discovered he had been shot 3 times in the head by a .22 caliber handgun. Everett was in critical condition. He was transferred to a major hospital, Mary Hitchcock Hospital, with dim prospects of recovery. The next day at Mary Hitchcock Hospital, Everett passed away, and a father and husband were stolen from his family. Meanwhile, the police were processing the crime scene. And an extraordinary stroke of luck, nobody turned off the water that had been running in the men's restroom since the horrid scene was discovered, demonstrating immense wisdom and quick thinking. When Sanborn's wife arrived, she was careful not to disturb the handles of the faucets either, and in order to kill the flow of water, she instead shut off the water pump from outside. The investigating officers believe that the robber may have been the last person to touch the bathroom faucet, and the shiny chrome of the fixture would provide an excellent surface for pulling a fingerprint. The state police crime scene technician worked carefully and pulled a good quality latent fingerprint from the faucet. The police interviewed everyone present and also canvassed the neighborhood. They were the ones to discover Everett's friend Marilyn, the woman he waved to, and they even found a man who heard the 3 gunshots as he was driving by the service station. He estimated the time of the shots as 9:45 a.m., but it was Everett's watch that would have the last word. His watch was struck by a bullet that froze the hour and the minute hand at the exact time of the shooting, which was 9:35 a.m. An autopsy was performed shortly thereafter, and the medical examiner determined that 2 of the gunshot wounds to his head had happened when Everett was upright, and the third one, which had gunpowder residue near the entry wound, was inflicted while Everett was on the ground. The gun was held nearly touching his head. The murderer clearly intended to leave no witnesses. On September 7th, 6 days after the crime, the New Hampshire State Police sent the fingerprint lifted from the faucet to the FBI to add to their national database. In the months that followed, the state police checked purchase records of .22 caliber firearms and collected as many guns from nearby residents in Andover and from outsiders who had recently purchased .22s in the vicinity. These guns were subjected to ballistic testing, but none of the guns collected had fired the bullets recovered from the scene or the victim. They also researched the nearby waterway, Blackwater River, hoping that the killer had ditched the weapon, but the searches turned up nothing. By the end of 1966, the case went cold. In 1975, a technology company called Rockwell International won a contract to create 5 automatic fingerprint readers. They delivered them to the FBI, and in the years that followed, the FBI successfully converted 15 million criminal fingerprint cards into digital records. Over the following 10 years, Rockwell sold systems to many major metropolitan police departments in the U.S., and the modernization of the old ink and paper fingerprint card system was truly underway. By 1999, the FBI's database, called Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, still the world's largest fingerprint database, contained fingerprints that identified 64 million individuals and were available on demand to law enforcement around the country. In 2009, the state of New Hampshire formed its cold case unit, and they did an inventory of all the unsolved homicides in the state's history, but Everett's name wasn't included on the list. He had been forgotten. It wasn't until 2013 when Everett's youngest daughter, Darlene, called up and brought it to their attention that efforts were renewed to solve the then 47-year-old cold case, and they didn't have to look very far. The fingerprint found at the crime scene had never been entered into and compared to known criminals in the IAFIS database. Long were the days of manually comparing fingerprints. By this point in 2013, the digital database, handled by the FBI, was a speedy method of matching fingerprints found at a scene against millions of people with a criminal rap sheet. When investigators submitted the fingerprints taken from the bathroom faucet, it came back with a match, and after cross-checking it with State Police Forensics Lab, the match was confirmed as belonging to Thomas Cass, who was 20 in 1966. The lab also tested the hair found in the cash register and the cigarette butt found on the ground, but was unable to pull DNA from either of them. Thomas Cass was no stranger to the law. He accrued 13 convictions between 1966 and 2000 for repeated charges of theft, armed robbery, aggravated assault, and escaping from prison twice. His final conviction in Vermont in 2000 was for manufacturing drugs at a federal prison. In the fall of 2013, 47 years after the crime was committed, New Hampshire investigators met with Thomas Cass. Cass told the investigators that he joined the Army at 18 around 1963 and left 3 years later under a general discharge, which in most cases means something wasn't quite up to standard. Cass told them that he had spent most of his life behind bars and acknowledged his criminal history, but he denied having any involvement in Everett's murder. He didn't know who he was and even claimed to not know where Andover was, saying he had only ever been to the state once in his life. A few months later, investigators met with Cass a second time, asking if he would submit a DNA sample, to which he agreed. But when asked to take a polygraph test, he refused. Around this time, people who were close to Cass were also interviewed. Friends, family, and an ex-wife, who told them that Cass first introduced himself to her as a businessman and a crook. She said that when they first met, Cass was working as a roadie for a rock and roll band, Miles Connor and the Wild Ones, which was known at the time for his wild New England rock and roll in a similar vein to the hip-shaking piano tunes of Jerry Lee Lewis. Cass's ex-wife told investigators that his home life growing up was rough. His father was an alcoholic and the household was abusive. She also said that he was a very violent person and on multiple occasions had threatened to kill her. She subsequently got a restraining order and ultimately a divorce. She mentioned that Cass would frequently brag about his crimes, proudly calling himself a career criminal. She also believed that he had no problem with hurting people to get what he wanted. A few months later, in February 2014, the investigators made a surprise visit to Thomas Cass. They said that forensic evidence had been collected at the scene of Everett Delano's 1966 murder that linked him to the crime. Cass refused to speak and requested a lawyer. Following the interview, a search warrant was granted in an attempt to find the .22 caliber handgun, but they didn't find the murder weapon. 4 days later, on February 24th, 2014, Thomas Cass shot himself with a .45 caliber handgun and died by suicide at the age of 67. His girlfriend, Jane, told the 911 operator that he believed the police were coming to arrest him that day in relation to a cold case, so he beat them to the punch, refusing to go back to prison again. The cold case unit told the Delano family in 2014 what they had learned about the fingerprint match and that the primary suspect had died by suicide. With his death, they said that they were confident who the killer was and that they would make an official announcement and issue their findings in a report. That report took 5 years to produce. On February 20th, 2019, New Hampshire Cold Case Unit finally released its formal report on the 1966 murder of Everett Delano and announced that after 52 years, the case had officially been solved. Susan Morrell, an assistant attorney general for New Hampshire who oversaw the cold case unit, stated that the reason it took 5 years to announce,
he made arrangements, so he's clearly very concerned that he was going to be arrested for this homicide. And so all of those actions combined, and the fingerprint.
Despite knowing since before Thomas Cass's death in 2014, was because of the intense verification process and a lack of resources and staffing for the department. In response to the news, the Delano family issued a statement. Our family would like to take the opportunity to not only thank the initial investigators of our father's homicide, but also the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit. Without their diligent efforts, we would not be here today. We are happy this day has come when our family has been given a small measure of justice. For almost 53 years, our family has wondered what happened on September 1st, 1966. There was a very long time our family didn't know if we would ever receive the answers about what happened that day. Today, our family has the long overdue answers we have been waiting for. But in a way, Everett Delano and his family never got justice. Cass evaded law enforcement by taking his own life. He fled from justice. At least the Delano family has some solace knowing their father's mystery killer isn't out there. Despite this, Everett's story is still one of hope. Hope that a case can be solved even after a lifetime's worth of years has passed. Hope against the naysayers who said this will never be solved. Hope that fights against the odds. So here's to the ones who fight for justice, whose cases have gone on 5 decades without answers. There is always hope. Ask about your family's case. There might be a fingerprint on file that's waiting for its match to be made. Number 2.
In 1974, there was a callous and cold-hearted murder of an exceptional young woman. Her name was Arlis Perry, and my heart goes out to the family and the community as a whole. A mother and father lost a daughter. A husband lost a wife. Our detectives have worked diligently over the years to solve the murder of Arlis. It comes with great honor to announce we solved the 43-year-old cold case.
In October 1974, Stanford University, California, was rocked by the sadistic killing of young Arlis Perry. The recently married bride had gone to the university's church to pray late one night, only to never come back alive. The case remained unsolved for more than 4 decades before advancements in DNA analysis led to the killer's identity. Arlis Perry hailed from Bismarck, North Dakota, and was the youngest of 3 children in her family. She married her high school sweetheart, Bruce Perry, and after 2 months of the marriage, they moved to Stanford, California. Bruce was a sophomore pre-medical student at the university, and Arlis had found a job as a receptionist at a law firm close by. She and her husband were both 19 years old at the time of the horrific incident in their lives, which they had not foreseen being in their own fairyland. On the night of October 12, 1974, Arlis and Bruce were taking a walk on the campus when they had an argument. Disheartened by the argument, Arlis decided to go to the church to pray. She had entered the church just before midnight. When she didn't return home even after 3 a.m., a worried Bruce reported her missing. A search ensued for Arlis, but she was not to be found anywhere around the church or in the locality. The search for Arlis ended the next morning with a truly gruesome discovery. The security guard found her dead in the church at around 5:45 the next morning. Arlis was found lying face up on the floor in a spread eagle position. She was nude from the waist down, and her right arm was pinned under her waist. She had been strangled and molested. A tall candle had been inserted into her private part, and another was forced between her breasts. She was stabbed with an ice pick in the back of her head. The police noted that there was no evidence of a struggle at the scene. The security guard, Crawford, had locked up the church a little after midnight after noticing no apparent activity inside. He also claimed to have rechecked the doors around 2 a.m. and found that they were still locked. When he visited the church at 5:45 a.m. to open it for the day, he found the west side door open and that it had been forced from the inside. The discovery of Arlis in such a dreadful condition made the authorities and her family think about who could have possibly committed such an inhuman crime. Every killer has some conscience and righteousness, but this killer seemed to have no moral or human boundaries at all. It possibly seemed to be a deed done by a bloodthirsty, perverted animal. Investigators found semen on a kneeling pillow near Perry's body. They also found a partial palm print on one of the candles. For a time, the authorities suspected her husband, Bruce Perry, and security guard Crawford as the probable murderers, but neither the semen nor the print matched Bruce Perry or Crawford. The Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office also ruled out any links between the murder and 3 previous killings in the area dating back to February 1973. Perry's husband was an initial suspect, but was eventually ruled out. Crawford, much like alleged Golden State Killer Joseph D'Angelo, didn't set off too many alarm bells for those who knew him. Crawford's landlord said that the retiree was a good guy and he never caused any problems. Although Crawford was considered a suspect, there was nothing tying him to the crime at that point. However, he was not completely ruled out. At least 7 people were in the Stanford Memorial Church during the night of October 12th and the morning of October 13th. Among them were Perry and Crawford. 4 other people were identified, but a 7th was not. A passerby noted this young man was about to enter the church around midnight. He had sandy-colored hair and was not wearing a watch, was of medium build, and stood about 5'10". In 1979, David Berkowitz, who was in jail after being convicted for the Son of Sam killings in New York City, sent a rather interesting book to the authorities in North Dakota called The Anatomy of Witchcraft. There was a message inside which said, Arlis Perry, hunted, stalked, and slain, followed to California Stanford University. Maury Terry then speculated that Arlis was killed at the hands of a satanic cult, who followed her from Bismarck to Stanford. David also sent a letter to the Stanford police in 1981, writing that he had information regarding the Arlis Perry case. The detectives flew down to question him, but David didn't give them anything concrete. The case remained open and was routinely reviewed as a cold case by the cold case unit of the Santa Clara County District Attorney's and Sheriff's Office. The alleged connections to the cult would come to an end with a breakthrough in 2018. Using modern DNA technology, the cold case unit dealing with the case compared a new DNA sample from a piece of Arlis's clothing, which turned out to be a match to the security guard Stephen Blake Crawford. He had been living in an apartment in San Jose, California, and according to the manager of the apartment, he had been getting by on Social Security or retirement. In June 2018, police went to Stephen's house to serve a search warrant after DNA connected him to the crime. Upon knocking on his door, Stephen was seen with a handgun and police backed off. He committed suicide by shooting himself in the head shortly after. Stephen had always been considered a suspect and had been interviewed by the police recently as well. At his place, the authorities found the sleeve of Maury Terry's book, The Ultimate Evil, and what they believed was a 2-year-old suicide note written by Stephen after he was interviewed by a detective. The motive was still unclear, but nevertheless, he was linked to the crime almost 44 years later. Unfortunately, Stephen did not live long enough to face his trial. This case was covered in detail with the John Jetrue murders in a February 2020 episode of Case File True Crime Podcast. The supposed links between David Berkowitz and the Perry murder were outlined in the Netflix documentary The Sons of Sam: A Descent into Darkness. Again, in this case, the criminal evades the law and escapes the consequences by taking his own life. What kind of psychopathic tendencies makes one so violent and inhumane? Does it make it any easier for the authorities to close such cases, or justice is actually snatched from the victim's fate? What do you guys think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you liked the video, hit that like button, share this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to never miss an update on more such cold cases, which are testimony of miracles.